Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. Apologies that we're running a minute late, but it is lunchtime on the East Coast, so I hope that everybody is getting settled. We're going to get started in just a second. Before I do that, I wanted to give a thank you to our sponsors, Arginex, CSL Behring, Grifols, and Takeda. We have a great program today, thanks to Dr. Jeff Allen and Dr. Mazen Dimachkie, who are joining us to chat all about research updates, and we're really excited to hear from them. Before we get into that, I just wanted to give a couple of housekeeping reminders. We are not able to answer specific questions about your particular case on this webinar. This is meant to be educational and informative for the whole community. If you do have a question that isn't being answered, please find the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and you can type it in there. If we don't get to your question live, please feel free to follow up with us at info@gbs-CIDP.org. Again, thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to bring the screen down and bring our speakers. As I mentioned, we have Dr. Jeff Allen and Dr. Mazen Dimachkie joining us, both very well-regarded leaders in the GBS-CIDP and MMN research field. So this is such a treat. We're so happy to have you. I'm looking to the screen as a note for the audience. If I look off screen, I'm looking at my notes and the questions that have been submitted already, so bear with me. So the first thing I wanted to say is, when we think about research or when we try to Google it, the first thing that comes up are those stock images of people pipetting or under the microscope and things like that. But we know that research is so much more than that. Those images are reflective of basic research, and that's so important for understanding the biology and the pathophysiology of diseases. But there's so much other research that happens that benefits the community. Dr. Allen, first of all, before you answer, I'm hoping you can give just a 30-second introduction of yourself. And then my question for you is, can you first define translational research and some of the things that are happening there?
Sure. Thanks, Chelsea, for the introduction, and thanks everybody for being here. It's really great to talk to everybody in this format. I'm Jeff Allen. I'm from the University of Minnesota. I'm a neurologist, neuromuscular specialist, and I have a really special interest in helping out folks with autoimmune inflammatory neuropathies, GBS, CIDP, multifocal motor neuropathy, and all the related neuropathies as well. Spent a lot of time on clinical trials and better understanding how to improve diagnosis and treatment of these diseases. So your question is a really, really important one. And it's a kind of, we have these different areas of research that are all equally and really important. On the one side, you mentioned the basic research or the bench research, where we're really understanding how does a disease work on a really microscopic, cellular, molecular level. A lot of those studies are done in the laboratory, outside of people or animals. On the other side of the spectrum, you have clinical trials, where we really take a compound or a drug and we study it in folks with a disease to see if it works and to see is it effective and is it safe. And there are different stages of the trial where our focus sort of shifts, but always is, does the drug work and is it safe to use? And then in the middle, you have this area of research called translational research, where you really try to bridge those two big areas of research, taking the drug out of the lab into maybe animal models, if that's appropriate to do so, and then taking it into healthy people, to see if it's safe and understand some properties of the drug, like what dose is appropriate, how long does the drug last for. So when you really study it in disease, you know what to study, how much to study, and who to study it in, and then you work through your clinical trials. So for these translational studies, it's really all about bridging the gap between what we do in the lab and then what we do in a lot of people with disease.
Thanks. Dr. Dimachkie, I think you do a bit of work there as well. So can you give us just a very quick introduction of yourself, and did you have anything to add?
Thank you for inviting me to speak and discuss questions that are pertinent to the audience of the GBS-CIDP Foundation International. My name is Mazen Dimachkie. I'm a neurologist, neuromuscular specialist that treat adults with neuromuscular disease at the University of Kansas in Kansas City, Kansas. And then research is near and dear to my heart. Actually, what we've done here at the University of Kansas Medical Center over the last now 16 years that I've been here, is build a research trial unit in nerve and muscle disease that is probably one of the largest, if not the largest, research trial unit in North America. In totality, we're involved in about 100 clinical trials that span not only CIDP, GBS, MMN, but also ALS, myasthenia gravis, another autoimmune disease of the nerve muscle junction, myositis, but also muscular dystrophy. And myositis is an autoimmune disease of the muscle itself. So I think that there's a tremendous importance, and I agree fully with what Dr. Allen's mentioned, of clinical research, the translational aspect, taking it from a cellular model whereby you have some proof of concept that there's a likelihood of success before going to human and going through different phases of research so that we have discovery of novel drugs. And then clearly, when it comes to CIDP and GBS, we've been locked into pretty much the same therapies for quite a while, 20 years, 30 years. And it's time for us to discover novel drugs and novel approaches because, as we know, not everybody responds the same way. Everybody has a different response. And from different studies, could be up to 20% perhaps of CIDP patients that don't have a great response to treatment. So we need to find better therapies to increase the range of therapies available for patients with autoimmune nerve disorders. So that's the importance of clinical research here. And it kind of is nerve-wracking for patients because usually when we talk about clinical research, people think I'm going to be a guinea pig in a study. I'm going to be getting placebo, possibly. I don't want placebo. But the realities of it are, without having a placebo control group, how can we tell if a drug is working or not? Now, one of the things that scares people, again, is placebo, but we have safeguards in studies because, probably everybody knows this, but for a study to move forward, it has to go through something called an ethics board. An ethics board is making sure their primary goal is protecting the interest of human subjects. That's their primary goal, nothing else. Protecting human subjects. So you can imagine, as part of that protection, we're always compelled to have safeguards in the study to make sure if a patient gets worse and they're on placebo, that we can help them, rescue them from the worsening and get them back to what they were before they participated in the study. So people get nervous about it. Of course, there are other issues with clinical trials that make people nervous. But like, for example, my insurance will deny me care because I'm participating in a clinical trial. Also, this is kind of, there are some laws and regulations that should reassure patients, but I've seen that happen sometimes with research. So research, while it's not for everyone, I think we need people in rare diseases to participate in research. And when it comes to, for example, CIDP, it's a rare disease. Now, do we throw this around just casually and say because we don't see that many of that disease in our clinic? Well, it's not a casual statement. There's a definition to what a rare disease is. The NIH defines it as people that are afflicted by a condition in the US that are less than 200,000 in totality. So my estimate of CIDP number of patients is about 30,000 at the most. That's well less than the 200,000 threshold. So with rare diseases, we need that partnership, the engagement of patients to really be willing to participate in research so that we can advance discovery. And I probably answered the question. I went a little bit beyond, but I cannot help it, to just kind of set the stage to what the next questions might be. Thank you for your question.
No, that's great. I think we're starting on a good base. So I talked very briefly about the basic research with the microscopes and the biology. Dr. Allen touched a little bit on the translational, and you've laid the groundwork for the clinical research. And really, we need all spectrums of those research to be successful to really advance both the knowledge of the disease and then therapies and how to treat those diseases as well. So I think we're starting in a really good place here. But I want to back up and talk a little bit more about some of that translational research, especially in the form of large natural history studies. So Dr. Allen, you are the chair of our Global Medical Advisory Board, and you help us lead our investment strategy for the foundation and research. So we fund basic research grants at the bench side, and then we invest again in these large natural history studies. The ones that get thrown around a lot are IGOS and ink-based. So first, can you define, what those mean, and then talk a little bit about the accomplishments of those large natural history studies and how that advances research?
Yeah, those are really big, important studies that are going on. So two big studies that are natural history registry. One is called IGOS, and the other you mentioned is ink-based. So IGOS, was launched several years ago, I think 7 or 8 years ago, and this is a registry for Guillain-Barré syndrome. And essentially, what the idea with this registry is that you take people across the world, across the globe, that develop GBS, and then you collect the same data at the same time on all these people, which might include some clinical records, things that you might be exposed to, even blood samples or biomaterials in some cases. And then you follow those outcomes prospectively over time. And what you can do when you start to collect this type of information on that massive scale all around the world, you can really start to define the disease and understand the disease in ways that no individual center or even country can tend to do that. Dr. Dimachkie talked about rare diseases. If there's only a small handful of people that are in the US that are affected, then it's hard for us to really define those things. So IGOS, that was the whole intent of IGOS. And now we're seeing coming out of IGOS all sorts of research and publications that are really helping us understand the biology of the disease, the prognosis of the disease, maybe what best treatments are, how to diagnose it, really a wealth of data. And so it's really exciting to see that actually, you collect the data and then you want to see what you get out of it. And we're starting to see that. So ink-based is kind of a similar sort of concept, but not with GBS, but instead with CIDP. This is a study that was just launched, within the last 2 years worldwide. Big presence in the US, big presence of other countries. The idea is the same though. Collect the same information on a group of people and follow that prospectively. And we're hoping that over the next couple of years, we can start to see, the same sort of information come out of that. Better diagnosis, pathophysiology, what treatments work, who they work in, and then maybe some different biomaterials and biomarkers for the disease. So it's a really exciting pair of studies. We're hoping to do similar things in other diseases. There's another a similar registry for anti-MAG neuropathy called the Imagine study, and we're hoping to eventually develop a similar one for multifocal motor neuropathy. So all of these different types of funding sources are really important. You mentioned about funding. Funding, is critical, and it just speaks to the importance of, when we're doing research, partnerships with academics, nonprofit organizations, industry, regulatory, and of course, all of our patients and patient collaborators. We all got to work together in order to get this done, and that funding is really, really important.
That's very well said, and thank you so much, and thank you for your role as the chair of our Global Medical Advisory Board. Very quickly, so IGO stands for International Guillain-Barré Outcomes Study, and remind me of what ink-based stands for.
So ink-based, ink is the Inflammatory Neuropathy Consortium, which is the group of us that really have kind of wanted to understand inflammatory neuropathy, in particular, CIDP. So it's Inflammatory Neuropathy Consortium, and base just means database. So CIDP database.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you also for mentioning the Imagine study for anti-MAG. And then earlier in this week, we talked a little bit on another webinar, actually. It's Research Webinar Week here at the Foundation. We talked with some of the MMN community about observational studies. And like you said, hopefully getting something up and running for the MMN community as well. So a lot of exciting stuff happening on that side. But Dr. Dimachkie, you already pointed out there's a lot going on in the clinical research space. So the GBS-CIDP Foundation, we have a large patient community, GBS patients, CIDP patients, MMN patients, anti-MAG, and other variants. Let's break those down a little bit. Can you tell us what's going on in the GBS clinical research world first, starting with GBS only?
GBS only. This is where we're going to start. So thank you for the question again. I think I would like to amplify some of the important messaging that Dr. Allen mentioned in regards to the IGOS, the International GBS Outcome Study. So part of the utility of this study, GBS living it acutely in the early phases is quite a difficult matter because many patients end up paralyzed on the ventilator. And what's going to happen to me? How am I going to recover? Will I be or not needing a ventilator? Are there some biomarkers that are prognostic of my recovery? All of those questions, some have already been answered by IGOS and others are being answered. For example, part of the publications and the rich publication of IGOS have included prediction models of who will be on the ventilator. That's been published in the last 2 years. Also, within the last year, there have been publications updating what the outcome of being able to walk independently, the probability based on simplified predictive models. Not only that, there are tissues there that are available, blood tissue that's available for different studies that drill down and investigate different components of GBS. And to top that off, you have more than 2,000 patients internationally enrolled across the world in this study. So you can imagine where if a drug intervention is being tested, this would be a rich control group, a natural history control group that could serve for future clinical trials. So IGOS is a phenomenal task, and I congratulate, again, Dr. Allen and others on launching the INK-base, which will hopefully produce similar data. Now, I'm going to start with GBS studies, and I wish there was more to talk about on GBS studies, specifically beyond IGOS, and I'm waiting for the next big development. One way to know about clinical trials and what's going on in clinical trials is go onto a website called clinicaltrials.gov, and you put your disease name, and it comes up with a list of different studies, and you can put different filters. You can put, for example, studies that are currently recruiting. You click on that, it gives you only those studies where they actually are admitting patients into a study. And I find that to be a very helpful resource for my patients. I teach them how to fish and they can do it on their own and in between visits. And then at the visits, I update them about where research is. So specific to GBS, there is a study that's currently ongoing in Bangladesh that's looking at a drug called ANX005. It's a code name for a drug. And this is what's called a monoclonal antibody, a IgG4 monoclonal antibody that's humanized. And it has high affinity to a component of complement and blocks the complement cascade. We think that complement is important in producing the disease in GBS. So it makes sense that testing a complement blocker in patients with GBS would probably benefit patients. So the study is ongoing, is currently recruiting patients in GBS in Bangladesh. Now, Dr. Allen might be aware of additional studies going on that I've not discovered in my survey. Dr. Allen, is there something else you would like to add when it comes to GBS studies?
That's the main clinical trial that's happening in GBS. There's another Japanese study that it's also looking at a complement inhibitor that we're waiting results on.
Yes.
Great.
That's the one where more patients were able to run compared to walk, and there was a follow-up study on that for that drug. Thank you. Yes.
Great, thank you. And clinicaltrials.gov is a great resource to find ongoing clinical research. The foundation also hosts a page on our website. We affectionately call it our research portal. So if you visit our website, go to research, participate in research. It's maybe not always as comprehensive because we have a process of who is listed there, but it does have a very good comprehensive view of the clinical trials being done in the space. So we have a couple audience questions that I've been collecting, and there's one coming up here. So, when we talk about clinical trials, I think the thought immediately goes into how we treat that disease. But many patients, that are in our community have already been treated for GBS, and now they're looking to live their best life with GBS. So can you talk at all about any research that you're aware of being done about residuals of GBS? And, we got a whole bucket list of things that people are still experiencing: facial issues, numbness, tingling, weakness, fatigue, things like that. I have a second part to this question. So number one, is there anything going on with GBS residuals research? Number two, if not, how do we get that research to happen?
Maybe I can start it and Dr. Allen can add to it if that's okay, or would that be okay?
Got it. Yep.
Okay, so when it comes to GBS, the truth is there are not enough studies looking at rehabilitation of chronic GBS symptoms, and residual symptoms, numbness, weakness, are common in patients with GBS. There are some interventions, and again, consulting with clinicaltrials.gov and probably the GBS-CIDP Foundation website, you may have seen some of those that are going on. There's a study actually that was published on the effect of robot-assisted gait training in patients with GBS. It was a cross-sectional study that was published, I think, just recently, and in it they claim it's an uncontrolled study, meaning everybody got the same intervention and patients got better. Now we know patients with GBS do get better, but seemingly all patients got better in the study. So it's not a well-controlled study. It kind of gives reason to look at this perhaps in a more controlled fashion, having a different intervention than the robot and looking at recovery of GBS. But then that's one of the studies. The other study that is out of Pakistan is looking at what's called proprioceptive neuromuscular training on sensory and motor function in GBS. And in this study, which is listed on clinicaltrials.gov, the general idea is, can you enhance recovery by having patients stand on a foamy surface and do 3 sets of different exercises, such as throwing a ball to each other and catching it, and other exercises that challenge your balance and coordination. And that's what they called proprioceptive neuromuscular training. So this study is ongoing, but you know, funders tend to fund exciting studies that have this kind of gold shiny thing to them. And so far, I've not seen that be a recovery from GBS, even though it's extremely important for all of us, physicians treating GBS, but also for patients. I've not seen this kind of hunger from funders to jump and say, yes, I want to do fund and support this kind of recovery study. So, Dr. Allen, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think you can think about this as sort of two main areas. One, you've got GBS, you have residuals. How do you manage or better treat those residuals? Fatigue, weakness, balance, quality of life, all of those things we know. A specific study to explore those things specifically in the context of GBS is challenging. Dr. Dimachkie mentioned some. We hope that this is one of the main things that will come out of INCBASE, that will really understand this prospectively on how to manage all of these things. So INCBASE is kind of folding all of those things in together. The other way to look at this is, so you've got GBS, but really what you're looking at is a nerve injury. How, in more general terms, can we understand how to make a nerve regrow, nerve repair and regeneration? That's really the holy grail of not just GBS residual research, but all neuropathy research in general, how to repair a nerve after it's been damaged. And this is very much on the bench level, the basic science level, but there's a lot of really exciting research coming out of here on how to better understand nerve regeneration, repair, regardless of what the initial injury of that was. So it's still a ways off, but I think there's a lot of exciting stuff that's happening more on the bench side, hopefully soon on the translational side, for just nerve repair and regeneration, more generally.
Dr. Allen, I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because that's like the number one thing that patients write in about, that they would love to see research happen. Aside from better treatments and things, we get so many responses asking about nerve repair. So just a quick follow-up, you said it's still a ways off and it's kind of in that bench phase. If you had to put like an amount of years or amount of time on it, what would you say?
You're pinning me down there on a tough question, but hopefully I'll see it, as with over the next couple of years, we can start to see things that are, moving, out of the lab into animal models. We've seen some animal models starting to do some of the things like this. But when you're doing those research searches on PubMed, think about other things that are happening, not just in GBS and CIDP, but after acute nerve injuries, acute trauma, other types of neuropathies, how to repair those nerves, and hopefully those will make their way into our diseases over time as well.
Thank you. And I know that was a difficult question. We won't hold you to that, but I think it helps the community kind of see where the field is going. And it's all really exciting so far. So thank you guys. So we're about halfway through almost, and please, to the audience, if you have more questions, feel free to utilize that Q&A box. Let's move to CIDP clinical research, and there's a lot going on here. So we started with Dr. Dimachkie last time. Let's go to Dr. Allen first for CIDP research.
Yeah, it's an exciting time to be in this field, and I think about this in a lot of different aspects. So you think about what the basic science of it is. A lot of very bright researchers trying to understand fundamental immunobiology of CIDP over the last couple of years. For example, we've seen the identification of specific antibodies that are present in people with CIDP. I think you'll continue to see that unlocking really just what is the cause of the disease. We know more about that now than we did 5 years ago, and I think that trend's going to continue. We talked a little bit about ink base and how that will inform us. But one of the exciting things is what's happening with the clinical trial space. And for CIDP clinical trials, you can kind of think about those in 3 different areas. One, we know we know what works in CIDP, IVIG, steroids, plasma exchange. But what we don't know is how we can do better with those standard of care treatments. What does combination therapy tell us? How can we do a better job at getting more out of our current therapies and understanding better ways to utilize these things in things like subcutaneous IG? So there's a lot of research right now that's looking at clinical trials that are looking at benefits of combination therapy or different ways to use subcutaneous IG in a more efficient manner. So that's one group of trials. Another group of trials are looking at drugs that are out there for different reasons and how to repurpose them for our disease. So you see some of these trials out there that have been done in the past, different immunosuppressants. Some have been successful. Historically, some have not been successful. But the trials that are ongoing throughout the world, one drug is rituximab, which is a very powerful, suppressing, B-cell suppressing drug, that we see a lot in case reports and case series. A lot of people are on it off label, and it seems to be helpful. But there's 2 trials that are running right now throughout the world, one in Japan, one in Italy, that are looking at rituximab and CIDP. Dr. Dimachkie has worked his tail off trying to get a similar study running in the US, and hopefully we'll see that at some point as well. But repurposing old drugs is another exciting aspect of clinical trials. And then the third wing is a new drug, novel therapies. And we're seeing a lot of new clinical trials for CIDP right now. The biggest 2 groups of drugs that we're seeing in CIDP, one are the same group of drug that we talked about for GBS, which are these so-called complement inhibitors, which attack a particular part of the immune system to sort of prevent damage to nerve by interfering with that. Those trials are in the early phase of CIDP, but they're happening. The bigger group of trials are with this group of drugs called FcRn antagonists. There's a number of different independent studies, 3 in fact, that are ongoing that are looking at this class of drug. Actually, one of those trials is completed, and they've released some top-line data to show that this particular drug was effective for prevention of relapse. So this group of FcRn antagonists are basically a way to target the body's mechanism for recycling antibodies that cause disease. And you can kind of trick the body into recycling antibodies that we think damage nerves in CIDP. So it's a very slick, targeted way to treat an autoimmune disease. And 2 ongoing trials, one trial that was recently completed and was a success, another trial that was recently completed and was not a success. But overall, I think you can expect to hear a lot about these new trials, these new drugs.
I can probably expand on the FcRNs a little bit more to just explain to the group how they work, those inhibitors. So what we learned, the biology of IgG is that it doesn't stay in the bloodstream only. The immunoglobulin G, that's one of your defense antibodies, it does tend to get into the lining of the wall of the blood vessel and circulate back out. And that's why it has a long half-life. It goes back out into the bloodstream. However, in order to do so, it needs something called FcRn, which stands for neonatal Fc receptor. And that FC receptor is important for the ability of the IgG to not be trapped into the cell. So you can imagine if you block that neonatal FC receptor, it cannot protect the IgG from being trapped in the cell. The IgG gets degraded in the cell, and your level of IgG goes down roughly by 50% by treatment with these agents. And we know that some of the pathophysiology of CIDP has to do with antibodies as well as complement, and there's complement that's a separate arm here for treatment from this. But when it comes to the antibody arm, it makes sense then to use and test FcRNs and figure out if they are effective, and hopefully they would be effective for CIDP.
Like you said, there's a lot going on and it's all very exciting. Just another note that the foundation hosts the participate in research section on our website that we affectionately call our research portal with some of the ongoing studies. Doctors, we got a question kind of about accessing that research. So can you tell us, where are these clinical trials happening? And somebody specifically kind of pointed out that if they're not seeing a center of excellence as designated by the GBS-CIDP Foundation, that they might be at a disadvantage for accessing that research. Can you talk at all about how people can access, these clinical trials?
Can get it started, and Dr. Allen can add to it. I think that clearly the GBS-CIDP Foundation International website is a good starting point for looking at access, first identifying which clinical trials are going on. Now, if you go to this website, it's one word, it's not two words, clinicaltrials.com. And it's plural, trials, not singular. Clinicaltrials.gov. It's not .com, it's .gov. And you can put it in the chat box for people if they want to see that. And you put your disease and look for recruiting studies, then you'll see listing there when you click on it. At the bottom of the listing, the very bottom, you'll see the sites where the study is being conducted. You'll see the contact information of the person at the site. Sometimes the pharma company prefers not to list the site. They will list their own contact as for who would be contacted if they're interested in participating. So that would be a way to do it. Now, of course, if you are at a site, like if you go to Dr. Allen, he'll tell you if he has a study going on. I know at KU, we have the CIDP 3001, which is an FcRn study. We're part of INC-base. We're part of the PDY 16744, which is a C1s monoclonal antibody. We're part of the Immunovant FcRn blocker study. So I'm sure you'll find the same wealth of studies that are available at KU over in Minnesota with Dr. Allen.
It's challenging though, depending on where you live and where you're coming from, to maybe find a center close to you. A lot of these trials do require a lot of travel, a lot of back and forth with the center. We've learned how to do some of these things virtually, but it still relies a lot on in-person meetings. So I can appreciate the frustration with trying to find a center that's close to you, convenient, especially on the one hand, if you really want to participate, and on the other hand, getting a match. Sometimes that's unfortunately just not possible with some of these rare diseases and limited number of study sites. There are other ways that you can get involved in research though. Different registries that we talked about, maybe those are available on the GBS-CIDP Foundation site, the research site. There's also access to different types of programs that maybe are not drug trials, but maybe other ways that you can get involved and contribute. But I hear the frustration behind that question. I'm trying to find a match between you and some place that's convenient and accessible.
Absolutely.
Add to this, if I might add to this, is there's a strong push in clinical trials to make sure that folks in rural area and away from academic centers of expertise to be included in studies. And this is by decentralizing clinical trials, making sure that we can use local resources in your community to have outcome measures being performed, the measures of success of a study, the safety data being obtained locally. There's a directional change. We're not there yet. So I hear your frustration about, I'm 300 miles away from the closest place where the research study is. I'm not going to be able to travel back and forth on a weekly basis. That's a huge hindrance. We get it.
Absolutely. And you took the point I was actually going to make, is that the foundation and regulators and industry research teams have such a focus on diversity in clinical trials that there is a lot of emphasis on how to make this work for more people. So even if you're not near a site, reach out and ask, because there might be things that you can do. But as Dr. Allen said, there are other ways to participate in research. And there's another section on our website that's not necessarily clinical trials, but other kind of maybe human factor or surveys to fill out. And all of that just adds to the wealth of knowledge to help advance that clinical research. So that was kind of all under the CIDP topic, but I think it's applicable to everybody listening, no matter your diagnosis. But let's move to MMN clinical research. What is going on there that's exciting? Dr. Dimachkie, I think you get to go first this time.
Thank you. So MMN is even less common than CIDP. The study that I'm aware of, and there could be more, is the study that is looking at a FcRn blocker in multifocal motor neuropathy. We don't know the results of the study yet. It completed enrollment. Again, the concept is that MMN, we think, is antibody mediated. Most patients, almost most patients, maybe half the patients at the most, will have a antibody of the IgM type to GM1. We also know that there's another antibody that is present in about 20% of patients with multifocal motor neuropathy. That's the NS6S antibody. So we know that there's an antibody link. So again, here it makes sense to reduce the level of antibodies and hopes to improve the disease. And there's a study that was completed. We don't know the results of it yet. It's a study of, again, blocking the neonatal Fc receptor in hopes to reduce the level of antibody and improve the outcome of patients with multifocal motor neuropathy.
I'm not sure about that study. I know there's a complement inhibitor study that's looking at multifocal motor neuropathy that's ongoing. It's a phase 2 study, but complement seems to be important in that space. So we're trying to understand that. That's an ongoing study. Yeah, and then as we commented earlier, there's an effort to really understand in the natural history better with MMN and developing a registry for that, similar to the other ones we've talked about.
Right. As Dr. Dimachkie mentioned, MMN is even more rare. So we said about 30,000 CIDP patients in the US. And is it correct? It's about 2,500 MMN patients in the US. Does that number sound correct?
All right.
That sounds about right to me. Yeah.
Yeah. So even more rare, and I think even more important that we engage the community on these research efforts, and we hope to be a resource for the MMN community as those research efforts move forward and through the space. So we talked about GBS, CIDP, MMN. Are there any other variants within our community getting attention in the research space? So anti-MAG, and then there's all of those other variants that you guys would probably know better than I would. Dr. Allen, let's go to you first.
Yeah, anti-MAG is the other big one, another rare condition on the order, similar to multifocal motor neuropathy, but MAG is a particular part of the nerve which is attacked by a particular antibody called the anti-MAG antibody. Causes a little bit of a different picture than CIDP and MMN, but it's autoimmune, progressive over time. There is a registry called the Mazin registry that's following the natural history of that condition. It's a frustrating disease because we don't have an evidence-based treatment for it, and there have been some clinical trials in the space. So I'm not aware of any active trials, but I know that there are some that are trying to better understand the disease process, to try to understand what trials would make sense for that condition. So anti-MAG's a big one.
Dr. Dimachkie, anything to add?
I think you said it very well.
So I think the moral of the story there is to stay tuned and continue to use the Foundation Research Portal as a website, clinicaltrials.gov, as Dr. Dimachkie mentioned. Dr. Dimachkie, somebody asked how you can be contacted. Can you repeat kind of where you are located? And then if someone has a specific question for Dr. Dimachkie, I'm happy to mediate that. You can send an email to the foundation and we can pass it on and get his response. But can you repeat where you're located and where you see patients?
My practice is at the University of Kansas Medical Center and in Kansas City, Kansas. And thank you for mediating the information beyond that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a couple other patient questions here. I'm just going to jump over to them. So these are a little more specific. So this one is, has single cell research been effective for CIDP resolution?
I think that there's total quiet here. I mean, it's a starting point. I mean, to say it's effective, it means that we've had several discoveries beyond what we have right now for CIDP that currently are on the market in the way of, effective therapies. I think we're on the road towards that, but to say that we're there, I think is not absolutely correct. But we have to keep in perspective that many of the drugs that go in the pipeline, as a matter of fact, most of the drugs that start with cell dish experiments, then animal experiments, then go on to human experiments, most of those, if you take them from the beginning, from the cell dish and animal experiment to humans, most drugs will fail. It's only when they get to be successful in phase 2 studies that there's a strong likelihood that the drug will be successful in a phase 3. And even then, it's not a home run. So that's my more general comment. I mean, there's some exciting models, and I'm not sure how excited Dr. Allen is about. There's at the last meeting in Miami, there was a description of the nerve on chip type of setup whereby different molecules can be tested in vitro within that model. So there's some advances that are going beyond cells that are making us optimistic about translational application from novel models to humans, but I don't see it quite yet being there.
I think that's helpful to know. Thank you very much for answering. The other audience question we have is about holistic therapy, and we kind of talked about this before a little bit, but do you have any kind of thoughts on holistic or kind of more natural medicine research that might be going on? Or again, if it's not happening, how do we use our advocacy to make it happen?
I don't know any trials that are specifically looking at holistic approaches, but we know that this is an important thing to do for everybody, and each person is unique and an individual. And so tailoring holistic therapies are important, which might include things like physical therapy or acupuncture, nutritional support, pain management, all of these things together. So again, something that the foundation, I know you've done a lot of education and support and bringing experts to speak with the community about this. These are also other questions that we'll learn through these different large registries, and who's using and accessing these types of therapies and how we might benefit patients. But I don't know of any specific studies that are studying that specific question.
Gotcha. Okay. I have one more that just came in about stem cell treatment, and I'm aware that a trial happened at some point. Can you guys talk about the stem cell treatment for CIDP?
Yeah, it's a very, very aggressive approach to treating the disease. And one has to keep in mind that although it's commonly referred to as stem cell treatment, it's really not about the stem cells. It's about massive and aggressive immunosuppressant therapy all at once. So basically what happens with these stem cell treatments is you take your stem cells out and then you massively suppress the immune system. You don't wipe it out, but you really, really knock it down. And then you put your stem cells back with the idea that those stem cells can repopulate your immune system faster than if you wouldn't give them, but your immune system would come back anyway. So by doing so, it's not as though the stem cells are doing anything different to the nerves, but the immunosuppressive is aggressive and upfront. That comes with a certain amount of risk to it, to be that aggressive with the immunosuppression. So that's where the risk and the danger comes. But doing that it may be helpful for some people, but a similar result can often be achieved without taking that on that degree of risk.
Got it. Thank you. Getting back to some of the earlier questions and discussion we were having, at the foundation, we often talk about the pillar. We have 4 pillars: support, education, research, and advocacy for the community. And we often really talk about research and advocacy being linked. There are 2 major government agencies that come to my mind when we talk about research and advocacy: the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. What role do those agencies play in advancing research, and how can we be more involved? So Dr. Dimachkie, let's start with you on this one.
I think that we'll start with the NIH, where I think that there's a big opportunity for advocacy organizations like GBS-CIDP Foundation International to really push for earmarking of funds towards CIDP, GBS studies, and the rare inflammatory autoimmune peripheral nerve disorders. When I look back, and maybe my search is incomplete, but when I look back at the last time the NIH funded a study, it was out of in 2008 of IVIG. There could be others that have been funded since then, but I've not been able to identify them. So I think there's clearly an opportunity for advocacy there, where I see a growing interest, and this is yet not translated into actual studies being funded, is with the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense has designated also CIDP as one of the areas of research interest. Now, unfortunately, when I've applied to it in the last year, I've been turned down. So I'm hoping that others, or I, will be more successful in the future when it comes to that. I think the patient voice is very important in really guiding the NIH mission and how funds are earmarked towards different studies. You know, you have strong competition. The strong competition is those common diseases: cancer, heart disease, stroke, that we're competing in that space for funding. And so sometimes with rare diseases like CIDP, it gets to be trickier to get funding. And this is where an organization that caters for more rare disease is important. I'm not going to steal from Dr. Allen's thunder. I'll stop here.
Before we go to Dr. Allen, I wanted to thank you for mentioning the DoD program. So the foundation does advocate to our senators every year to make sure that Guillain-Barré syndrome and then peripheral neuropathies are listed on that list of conditions able to be studied. And GBS research has been successful through that program. I think the other peripheral neuropathies, they're newer. So hopefully, as you said, in the future, we will see more success there. And it has been millions funded through that program, and we're very, very grateful for it. And that's a great example of the advocacy and research coming together. And if people want to be involved in that advocacy, please get involved with the foundation. You can visit our volunteer form on the website. So Dr. Allen, any final comments on the NIH, or do you want to talk about the FDA a little bit?
I think Dr. Dimachkie gave a nice overview of NIH, so maybe I'll just comment on the FDA. So the FDA is all about the protection of safety, safety, public health safety for drugs, devices, and food. So it's actually a huge umbrella that the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, oversees. But specifically as it has to do with drugs and drug development, they're going to want to see that a drug has been studied in a very rigorous way, and that it is showed clearly that it's efficacious, that it works for whatever specific disease it's targeting, and also that it's safe. And even more importantly, that this balance between safety and efficacy is of a threshold that makes it safe for public use and public consumption. So, and they're going to want to see clinical trials that have done in a certain way, that is both ethical and that is of a quality and a standard that is very convincing without, debate that the drug works and that the safety profile is efficacious. And if they do that and they review it, then they can give approval to that drug. So it's a very rigorous method. It's a very scientific method and pragmatic method in order to say that this drug is safe and it's got a reasonable side effect profile.
Very interesting. And I just want to mention, again, the foundation, continuing to grow our research and advocacy presence. We have big strategic plans to be more involved with the NIH, like Dr. Dimachkie was saying, and advocating there for the community research to be funded, and big plans with the FDA to bring the patient voice and what the patients want to be researched and things like that into the conversation. In fact, next year we'll be hosting an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, and that is through a program that was created by the FDA to hear input from patients living with rare conditions, to hear more about their opinions on research and the direction and things like that. So we're nearing the end of the program, and I thought we could end with me asking both of you probably the number one question. I've said this about several questions, but probably the number one question that we get at the foundation, just to hear your answer. So people often ask us, what is happening in research? And, you know, that's kind of the broad question that we get. So my question is, what would your elevator pitch be to answer someone who asks that question of the foundation?
Who wants to go first?
I'll go first. There's so much happening. It's such an exciting time to be in this area. It's, you know, it's frustrating to look behind the scenes and say, you know, we want more drugs, we want them now, we want to know they work. We all want this process to go faster, you know, but really over the last 5 to 10 years, we know about biology of all of these drugs, diseases that we didn't know even a decade ago. We know prognosis, we know how to predict prognosis much better. You know, and because we know so much more about the biology, we know so much more about how to target the treatments. So we're getting away from treatments that are non-specific general immunosuppressants, you know, and starting to think about this disease has this mechanism we can target in this way. Maybe that's with going after the complement immune system. Maybe that's suppressing B cells. Maybe that's attacking this little receptor, the FcRn receptor. But we can do it in a more thoughtful, focused way rather than just sort of, you know, wiping out the immune system in a non-specific way. So that's the really exciting thing to me. And then if I think about it, you know, a couple of years from now, I can start to think, you know, we know maybe through these platforms like InkBase, where we know more about the different types of CIDP, how it affects one person differently than the other, then we can really say, you've got these particular traits about your disease that makes us more likely that this particular drug will work. We've got all of these different evidence-based options, and we can really customize therapy to your disease. You know, we've got a lot of work to do. There's no question about it, but it's exciting to see that work happening right now.
Great. So I would say it sounds like evidence-based treatment and medicine, better understanding of the disease, and more personalized treatment approaches are the three kind of main points that you touched on there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Dr. Dimachkie, it's your turn. You're not getting out of this one.
Okay, well, before I get to this one, I'm going to say something about the FDA, just to remind everybody that FDA has a regulatory arm, which is for all biologics, all drugs, but also it has a not so well publicized funding side of it. There's an Office of Orphan Product Division for the FDA. And we've been successful in getting for rare diseases grants from that. So in addition to DOD, NIH, FDA, OOPD has a funding arm to it. But what I see, in having been in the research now for more than 20 years, is this increase in interest by pharma in looking at drugs with novel mechanism of action in CIDP. I would like to see that replicated in other autoimmune neuromuscular and nerve disorders. However, at least in CIDP, there was a time where all we had is either IVIG or sub-QIG being tested in different flavors. But now we've evolved. Now there are multiple studies going on concurrently exploring different mechanism of action in hopes that there will be targeted therapy based on subpopulations, ultimately, of CIDP that may be more likely to benefit by one drug compared to the other. So while it's an exciting time, I'm reminded of drug development, and I've had an interest in rare diseases. And one of the rare diseases that I was involved in, I started work on it in 2007, an early phase pilot study. Then I did the randomized control trial starting 2013. Then we published a paper just this year, October of this year. It gives you an idea about the horizon of drug development. it takes a long time. And I think one of the things, the benefits of the ink-based, and Dr. Allen is very modest when it comes to ink-based, is creating this network, this infrastructure of where hopefully in the future, clinical trials will be more centralized to those centers of expertise where those patients are identified and ready for clinical trials, because the big message is about clinical trial readiness altogether. And I think we're getting closer to that. Are we going there fast enough? I don't think so. Should we give up? Never. I think we're on the right track.
That sounds great. So it sounds like you're most excited about drug development and clinical trial readiness, as well as all of the great funding programs that are out there that we can continue to apply for and advocate for. Well, we're nearing the end of our time, and Dr. Dimachkie, Dr. Allen, I just want to thank you so much on behalf of the foundation for continuing this plight of research for this rare disease community. And I just want to also thank you for your time today. This has been an excellent, excellent discussion, and I feel like this is a great place for us to wrap up. I really appreciate your time. I'm just going to share my screen very quickly so that people can once again see our sponsors. Thank you so much to our sponsors to help us put on these virtual programs. If you have additional questions or if it didn't get answered fully today, please email us at info@gbs-cidp.org. For everybody watching and listening, you will receive a survey at some point this afternoon. Please complete that survey to help us continue to improve these programs, and we want to hear from you and what you have to say. Please join us next time. It's going to be about driving controls and some of those adaptations for driving for the community, and we're really excited about that conversation as well. So once again, thank you, Dr. Allen, Dr. Dimachkie, and thanks to everybody for tuning in this afternoon. Have a great rest of your day.